The opposition to Ambassador Talvesh's proposal organized quickly. General Kazthor was not just angry about the cubs sleeping during a lecture. He saw something much more dangerous. If Velkari cubs could be softened by human influence, then the entire foundation of Velkari military power was at risk. He began meeting with like-minded officers and politicians, forming a group dedicated to stopping what they called the corruption of warrior culture. They started a campaign on Velkari communication networks. They shared edited versions of the lecture video, adding commentary that made Hyun look like a manipulator rather than a teacher. They spread stories about other species that had become weak through excessive peace and were then conquered. They argued that the Velkari had survived because of their hardness, and any deviation from traditional training would lead to their destruction. But Kazthor and his group were not the only ones concerned about recent events. Across the galaxy, another organization had been watching humanity's rise with growing alarm. The Apex Coalition was not a single species, but rather a loose alliance of supremacist groups from dozens of worlds. They shared a common belief that predator species deserved to rule the galaxy, and prey species existed to serve them. Humans confused the Apex Coalition's ideology. Physically, humans were clearly prey. They were small, had no natural weapons, and came from a moderate gravity world. By all rights, they should have been servants to stronger species. Instead, they had become influential diplomats, successful merchants, and respected academics. They were climbing the galactic social hierarchy, despite their obvious physical inferiority. The Coalition had been looking for an opportunity to remind humans of their place. The video of Velkari cubs sleeping on a human professor's shoulders gave them that opportunity. Here was visual proof that humans were corrupting the natural order, weakening apex predators through psychological manipulation. If this continued, prey species might start believing they were equal to their natural superiors. The Coalition began planning an assassination. Killing Professor Hyun would serve multiple purposes. It would eliminate a specific source of corruption. It would terrorize other humans who tried to rise above their station. And most importantly, it would traumatize the Velkari cubs, making them associate humans with danger and death. The cubs would return to traditional warrior training, hardened by their experience. The Coalition recruited operatives from 3 different species. They would pose as maintenance workers at the academy, smuggle in weapons that could penetrate the security shields, and strike during a public lecture. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. The whole galaxy would watch as humanity learned the cost of overreaching. Meanwhile, Professor Minho had been tracking unusual activity on the Academy's network. As a scientist who specialized in data analysis, he had set up monitoring systems to watch for security threats. He noticed strange patterns in the maintenance schedules. Work orders were being filed for repairs that had already been completed. Equipment was being moved to locations where it wasn't needed. Communication logs showed conversations between staff members who should have no reason to contact each other. At first, Minho thought it might be simple corruption or theft. But as he dug deeper, he found something more concerning. The suspicious activities all seemed to center around one thing: Professor Hyun's classroom and schedule. Someone was learning his routines, mapping his movements, preparing for something. Minho brought his findings to Director Jiwoo, who immediately contacted Terran Security. The head of security, Colonel Dae-hyun, reviewed the evidence and reached the same conclusion Minho had. Someone was planning to hurt Hyun. They didn't know who or exactly when, but the threat was real. The question was what to do about it. They could cancel Hyun's classes and put him in protective custody, but that would disrupt the entire semester and send a message that humans could be intimidated. Or they could lay a trap, let the assassins make their move and capture them in the act. Colonel Dae-hyun preferred the second option, but it required using Hyun as bait. When they explained the situation to Hyun, he didn't hesitate. He agreed to continue his normal schedule. The work he was doing with the cubs and other students was too important to stop because of threats. He had always believed that fear should not dictate behavior, and he would not start living by different principles now. Ambassador Talvesh was informed of the threat. His reaction was immediate and volcanic. Someone was planning to harm the human who had shown his cubs kindness. The ambassador mobilized his personal guard, elite Velkari warriors who had protected the royal family for generations. He offered to position them around the academy, but Colonel Dae-hyun politely declined. Velkari guards would be too obvious and would alert the assassins that their plan had been discovered. Instead, they developed a more subtle strategy. Human Marines would disguise themselves as students and staff. Velkari guards would position themselves in adjacent buildings, ready to respond if needed. The Academy's security systems would be upgraded with new sensors that could detect concealed weapons. And most importantly, everyone would act normally so the assassins wouldn't suspect anything. The Cubs sensed something was wrong. Rix and Nyla had predator instincts that had been honed by millions of years of evolution. They noticed the increased tension among the staff. They detected the subtle changes in the Academy's daily routines. During class, they became more alert, their heads swiveling to track every person who entered the room. Hyun tried to reassure them, but they refused to relax. Nyla positioned herself between Hyun and the door. Rix took up a spot where he could see all entrances. They were no longer students in that moment. They were young predators protecting their pack member, and they would not be comforted or distracted. The next scheduled lecture was a public event on conflict resolution strategies. Over 100 students had registered to attend, and the Academy had advertised it widely as part of their community outreach program. It was the perfect opportunity for an attack. A crowded room, multiple access points, and plenty of chaos to cover and escape. On the morning of the lecture, Hyun got dressed as usual. He reviewed his notes, prepared his teaching materials, and walked to the lecture hall. The Cubs followed him, more tense than he had ever seen them. Their claws were extended slightly, ready for combat. Their eyes tracked every movement in the hallways, the lecture hall filled with students. Colonel Daehyun's team had identified 3 suspects: maintenance workers who had access to restricted areas and whose background checks showed suspicious gaps. They were being monitored carefully, but so far had done nothing overtly threatening. They had smuggled in weapons over several weeks, hiding components in cleaning equipment and tools. The weapons were designed to be assembled quickly from seemingly innocent parts. Hyun began his lecture on schedule. He talked about the psychological foundations of conflict, the importance of understanding different perspectives, the methods for finding common ground between opposing parties. His voice was calm and steady. If he was afraid, he didn't show it. Halfway through the lecture, during a transition between topics, the attack came. 2 of the maintenance workers revealed their weapons, energy projectors capable of punching through personal shields and armor. They had positioned themselves in different parts of the room, creating crossfire that would be impossible to avoid. But they had made one critical error in their planning. They had dismissed the Cubs as non-threats, assuming that young Velkari would be too inexperienced to respond effectively to a surprise attack. They had researched human security measures and planned for armed guards. What they hadn't planned for was 2 adolescent apex predators who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The first assassin raised his weapon. Before he could fire, Rix was on him. The young Velkari moved with blinding speed, covering 5 meters in less than a second. His claws raked across the assassin's arms, forcing him to drop the weapon. Rix's jaws closed around the assassin's shoulder, not biting hard enough to kill, but firmly enough to completely immobilize him. The entire attack lasted maybe 3 seconds. The second assassin managed to fire 1 shot. The energy bolt streaked toward Hyun. Nyla intercepted it, her armored scales absorbing the impact. The shot would leave a burn mark but wouldn't penetrate her natural armor. She crashed into the second assassin like a missile, bearing him to the ground. Her claws pinned his arms and legs. Her jaws hovered centimeters from his throat, making her intentions perfectly clear. The third assassin, seeing his partners subdued instantly, tried to escape. He ran for the exit and found his path blocked by Colonel Daehyun and a squad of Terran Marines. Behind them stood Ambassador Talvesh and his elite guards, blocking any other escape route. The assassin dropped his weapon and surrendered. The entire attack had lasted less than 15 seconds. The Cubs had neutralized 2 threats before most people in the room even realized what was happening. Hyun stood at the podium, unharmed, watching his students defend him with a mixture of pride and concern. He could see that the Cubs had injured the assassins but had carefully controlled their strength. They could have killed both attackers easily but had chosen to capture them instead. Security teams moved in to take custody of the prisoners. The footage spread across the Galactic network within hours. Someone in the audience had uploaded the recording and it went viral in a way that surprised everyone. Different species watched the video for different reasons. Some saw it as entertainment. Others saw it as proof of humanity's strange abilities. but many saw it as something more profound, something that challenged their basic assumptions about the galaxy. Ambassador Talvesh was in a meeting with other Velkari officials when his aide interrupted to show him the video. The conference room fell silent as they watched the human professor standing for nearly an hour, with their cubs sleeping against him. Talvesh replayed the video 3 times, his 3 hearts beating in complicated rhythms as he processed what he was seeing. The other officials reacted with anger. General Kazthor slammed his fist on the table, cracking the reinforced surface. This was unacceptable, he roared. The cubs were being trained as warriors, as future leaders of the Velkari military. Instead, they were being turned soft by this human, acting like pets instead of predators. The general demanded that the cubs be recalled immediately, and that Talvesh be removed from his position for allowing this contamination. But Talvesh was watching the video again, focusing on his children's faces. He saw something he had never seen before: peace. Rix and Nyla looked peaceful in a way that Velkari cubs never looked. They were always tense, always ready for combat, always proving themselves. But in that lecture hall, sleeping against their human teacher, they had finally looked like what they were: children. The Galactic Council called an emergency session. Representatives from hundreds of species gathered in the vast chamber on Neutral Station Harmony. The agenda was simple. What did this video mean? How should they respond? The debate raged for hours. Species after species stood to give their interpretation. The Krelin representative suggested that humans possessed some form of psychic manipulation. How else could they make the galaxy's apex predators behave so docilely? The Krelin had long suspected humans of hiding their true capabilities, and this seemed like proof. Several other species agreed, calling for investigations into possible human mental abilities. The Centauri ambassador took a different approach. She argued that this proved humans were dangerous in a completely different way. They were social engineers, capable of breaking down the natural aggressive instincts of warrior species. If they could do this to Velkari cubs, what could they do to other species? The Centauri had always been cautious about human expansion, and this incident reinforced their concerns. But then the Dravek philosopher wise elder Kavrin spoke. The Dravek were one of the oldest species in the galaxy, having achieved spaceflight millions of years before most current civilizations. They were respected for their wisdom and neutral perspectives. Kavrin's voice carried weight that few others possessed. She played the video again for the entire council. She asked them to watch carefully, not the cubs, but the human. Look at his face, she instructed. See the strain as he supports their weight. See how his legs shake with effort. See the sweat on his brow. This is not manipulation or mind control. This is physical sacrifice. This human is enduring pain to avoid disturbing the trust these cubs have placed in him. Kavrin continued her analysis. She pointed out that in the video, the human talks about vulnerability and trust while literally demonstrating both. He makes himself vulnerable by accepting the weight of dangerous predators. He honors their trust by refusing to push them away despite his discomfort. This is not domination or control. This is something the Dravik called bonding through mutual respect. The council chamber erupted in debate again. Some agreed with Kavrin's interpretation. Others remained suspicious. The discussion continued until Ambassador Talvesh requested permission to speak. As the father of the cubs in question, he had a unique perspective. Talvesh told them about his species' history. The Velkari had evolved on a brutal world where only the strongest survived. They had built their civilization on principles of power and dominance. Cubs were trained from birth to be warriors because anything less meant death. For millions of years, this approach had worked. The Velkari had conquered their world, reached the stars, and established themselves as a force to be respected and feared throughout the galaxy. But Talvesh asked a difficult question. What had they lost along the way? When had the Velkari last produced great art or music? When had they last made a scientific discovery not related to weapons? When had they last formed genuine alliances based on friendship, rather than strategic necessity? They were strong, yes. They were feared, certainly. But were they complete? He talked about watching his cubs grow up. He described how they never played, only practiced combat. How they never laughed, only roared challenges. How they never slept peacefully, always half alert for threats. He had accepted this as normal because he had experienced the same childhood. Every Velkari had. It was just the way things were. But now he had seen something different. His cubs sleeping without fear. his cubs learning that strength could coexist with gentleness, his cubs experiencing the kind of security that allowed them to simply rest. Professor Hyun hadn't weakened them. He had shown them aspects of life that Velkari culture had abandoned long ago. Talvesh proposed something radical. What if the Velkari were wrong? What if their approach to raising cubs was incomplete? He wasn't suggesting they abandon combat training or warrior traditions, but perhaps they could add something more. Perhaps cubs could learn to be warriors and also learn to be scholars, artists, diplomats. Perhaps strength could mean more than just the ability to destroy. The council chamber was silent as Talvesh finished speaking. Even General Kazthor, watching from the Velkari homeworld, had no immediate response. The idea was too revolutionary, too challenging to everything they believed. Meanwhile, back at the Terran Academy, Hyun was dealing with his own challenges. The cubs had finally woken up near the end of the lecture, confused about why so many people were staring at them. When they realized they had fallen asleep on their teacher, they were mortified. Velkari cubs were supposed to be alert and vigilant at all times. Yoon had sat down with them after class and explained that it was perfectly normal for young beings to get tired and need rest. He said he felt honored that they felt safe enough with him to sleep. He assured them it showed trust, not weakness. The cubs listened, processing this perspective that contradicted everything their instincts told them. Over the next few days, Hyun's life changed dramatically. He received interview requests from dozens of media outlets. Academic institutions across the galaxy wanted him to speak about his teaching methods. Several species requested that human advisors be sent to help with their own educational systems. Hyun turned down most of these requests. He was a teacher, not a celebrity, and he had students who needed his attention, but he did agree to one meeting. Ambassador Talvesh requested a private conversation, and Hyun sensed this was important. They met in a quiet garden on the academy grounds, away from cameras and recording devices. The ambassador towered over Hyun, his massive form casting a shadow that covered the human completely. Talvesh spoke about his species and their ways. He explained the philosophy that had guided Velkari culture for millions of years. Then he asked Hyun a question that clearly caused him pain. Had the Velkari been wrong all this time? Had they sacrificed too much in their pursuit of strength? Hyun thought carefully before answering. He said that every species had to find their own path, and he couldn't judge whether the Velkari approach was right or wrong. But he could observe that Rix and Nyla seemed happier now than when they first arrived. They still trained in combat. They still embraced their warrior heritage, but they also laughed sometimes, asked questions out of curiosity rather than necessity, and formed friendships with other students. He suggested that maybe it wasn't about choosing between warrior culture and everything else. Maybe it was about finding balance. The cubs could honor their heritage while also exploring other aspects of life. They could be fierce when needed and gentle when appropriate. Strength didn't have to mean hardness. It could also mean flexibility. Talvesh was quiet for a long time after Hyun finished speaking. Then he made a decision that would reshape Velkari society. He sent a message to the High Command proposing a new program. Selected Velkari cubs would be sent to study with other species, particularly humans. Not to replace their warrior training, but to supplement it. They would learn combat from Velkari masters and diplomacy from human teachers. They would become warriors who understood more than just warfare. The proposal sparked intense debate among the Velkari. General Kazthor opposed it violently, claiming it would weaken their species. But other voices, particularly younger Velkari, who had never been comfortable with the brutal efficiency of traditional training, supported the idea. The debate would continue for months. But the seed was planted, and it had started with two tired cubs who fell asleep during a lecture, trusting completely in a human who had shown them that safety and strength could exist together. The joint lecture was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. 3 departments had decided to collaborate on a special session about first contact protocols and the psychological foundations of interspecies diplomacy. Professor Hyun from xenobiology, Professor Minho from astrophysics, and Professor Jiwoo from cultural studies would present together. The lecture hall could hold 200 students and every seat was filled. Representatives from 40 different species had come to hear about humanity's approach to meeting new civilizations. The cubs had become minor celebrities on campus by this point. Other students no longer fled when they approached. Some even greeted them respectfully in the hallways. Rix and Nyla still maintained their predatory dignity, but they had learned to modulate their behavior around smaller species. They saved their aggressive displays for the training grounds where they practiced combat with other large species under supervised conditions. That morning, Hyun had noticed both cubs seemed tired. They had been working hard on a major research project about cross-species communication barriers. The project required analyzing hundreds of first contact scenarios and identifying patterns in successful versus failed interactions. It was complex work, and the cubs had thrown themselves into it with typical Velkari intensity. They probably hadn't slept much in the past few days. The lecture hall buzzed with conversation as students filed in and found seats. The cubs followed Hyun to the front of the room, taking their usual positions near the podium where they could watch both him and the audience. It had become their habit, this protective positioning. Hyun had tried to explain they didn't need to guard him, but they seemed to consider it their duty. Professor Minho started the lecture by discussing the mathematical probabilities of encountering intelligent life in the galaxy. He explained how humans had initially assumed they were alone, then had to rapidly adjust their worldview when the Gentari made contact. The discovery that the galaxy teemed with hundreds of intelligent species had been both thrilling and terrifying for humanity. Professor Jiwoo took over next, talking about the cultural shock of first contact. She described how different species had vastly different concepts of personal space, communication styles, and social hierarchies. Early human diplomats had made many mistakes, accidentally offending species by using wrong gestures or misunderstanding intentions. But humans had learned, adapted, and developed new approaches to bridge these gaps. Then it was Hyun's turn. He walked to the center of the stage, his movement triggering the cubs to shift slightly, maintaining their protective formation. He began by talking about fear and trust. He explained that fear was a useful survival mechanism, but it could also prevent meaningful connections. The key to successful first contact, he argued, was learning to distinguish between reasonable caution and irrational fear. He used examples from Earth's history. He talked about how different human cultures had met and clashed, but also merged and enriched each other. He described the painstaking work of learning languages, understanding customs, finding common ground. He suggested that the same principles applied on a galactic scale. Every species, no matter how different, shared certain fundamental needs and drives. Understanding those commonalities was the foundation of diplomacy. The cubs listened intently, as they always did. Rix had positioned himself on Hyun's left side, while Nyla stood on his right. About 30 minutes into Hyun's portion of the lecture, Nyla shifted her weight. She had been standing for a long time, and her young body was tired from days of intense study. Almost unconsciously, she leaned slightly against Hyun's shoulder. Hyun felt the weight but didn't react beyond adjusting his stance slightly to accommodate it. He continued speaking about the importance of consistent behavior in building trust. Nyla leaned a bit more, her massive head now resting gently against him. Her eyes began to close. Within moments, she was asleep, her breathing deep and even. Rix noticed his sister's position. Some instinct made him move closer as well. Perhaps he didn't want to be left out. Perhaps he was equally exhausted. Or perhaps after weeks of feeling safe around this human, his guard had simply dropped completely. He mimicked his sister's position, leaning his head against Hyun's other shoulder. His eyes closed. The rumbling purr started, barely audible but unmistakable. The lecture hall went completely silent. Every being in that room froze, staring at the scene before them. 2 Velkari cubs, each weighing over 100 kilograms, were sleeping peacefully against a human professor, who barely came up to their shoulders when they stood upright. The combined weight pressing against Hyun was enormous. His knees bent slightly as he braced himself. Professor Jiwoo stood at the side of the stage, her hand covering her mouth in shock. Professor Minho had gone pale. The security team positioned around the hall tensed, unsure whether to intervene. Students in the audience leaned forward, not wanting to miss a moment of this unprecedented scene. Several began recording, knowing this was historic. Hyun glanced at his colleagues. He could see the panic in their eyes, the silent question of what he should do. He made a decision in that moment. Moving would wake the cubs. Waking them might startle them. Startled Velkari cubs could react violently on instinct. More importantly, these cubs trusted him enough to sleep in his presence. That trust was precious and fragile. He would not betray it by pushing them away. He continued his lecture. His voice remained steady, though he had to work to keep his balance. He talked about vulnerability and strength. He explained that showing vulnerability was not weakness, but rather the foundation of genuine connection. No species could build real relationships while maintaining perfect defensive postures all the time. Trust required risk. The irony of illustrating this point while literally supporting two sleeping apex predators was not lost on anyone. Hyun spoke about how humans had learned to see past surface appearances. Early human history was full of examples where people had feared what they didn't understand. But humanity had grown past that, learning to evaluate individuals based on their actions rather than their species' reputation. He shifted his weight carefully, trying to distribute the cub's mass more evenly. His legs were starting to shake with the effort, but he kept talking. He discussed the psychological research about attachment and bonding. He explained that young beings from all species needed safety and security to develop properly. When that need was met, they grew into healthier, more stable adults. Several students in the audience were taking notes frantically. Others just watched, mesmerized by what they were witnessing. A Dravic philosopher in the third row had tears in her multiple eyes. She understood the profound significance of this moment in a way that transcended species. The galaxy's most feared warriors, vulnerable and peaceful, protected by nothing but a human's gentle care. 40 minutes passed. Hyun's shoulders were on fire. His legs trembled with effort. Sweat beaded on his forehead. But he did not stop speaking, did not ask for help, did not disturb the sleeping cubs. He talked about the future of interspecies relations. He painted a picture of a galaxy where different species worked together not out of fear or necessity, but out of genuine friendship and mutual respect. Professor Jiwoo finally stepped forward. Sensing that Hyun was reaching his physical limits, she took over the presentation smoothly, allowing Hyun to focus all his energy on remaining standing. She spoke about practical applications of these theories, giving Hyun a chance to rest his voice at least, even if he couldn't rest his body. The cubs slept through it all. Their breathing was peaceful and regular. Occasionally, Rix would make small purring sounds. Nyla's tail wrapped loosely around Hyun's leg, a gesture of comfort and security. They were completely at ease, trusting with the absolute certainty that only children could have. When the lecture finally ended, the audience sat in silence for a long moment. Then someone began to clap. Others joined in. Soon the entire hall erupted in applause. Not the polite academic recognition typical of lectures, but genuine, emotional appreciation for what they had witnessed. This wasn't just a lesson about diplomacy. This was diplomacy happening in real time, showing what could be achieved when fear was replaced with understanding. Hyun looked down at the sleeping cubs and smiled despite his exhaustion. These fierce young warriors who had terrified everyone just weeks ago now trusted him completely. And in that trust, in that simple act of falling asleep on his shoulders, they had taught the entire galaxy a lesson more powerful than any lecture could provide. The morning started like any other at the Terran Academy, with students from dozens of worlds filling the corridors between classes. Professor Hyun stood in his classroom, arranging his teaching materials on the desk. He had been teaching xenobiology for 3 years now, and he genuinely enjoyed every moment of it. The chance to learn about different species while helping them understand each other felt like the most important work he could do. His colleague Jiwoo rushed into the room, her face pale with worry. She grabbed his arm and whispered urgently. The Velkari delegation was arriving today and they were bringing cubs. Actual Velkari cubs. Hyun nodded calmly, but Jiwoo shook her head. He didn't understand, she insisted. The Velkari were apex predators from a brutal high-gravity world. Their adults stood 3 meters tall, weighed over 400 kilograms, and could tear through reinforced steel with their bare claws. And the cubs were coming to his class. The other professors had already refused to teach them. Director Minho had personally asked Hyun to take them on, knowing his reputation for patience. Hyun had agreed without hesitation, much to everyone's shock. Now, as the morning progressed, he could feel the tension building throughout the academy. Staff members whispered in corners. Students from prey species requested transfers to other classes. Security personnel checked their weapons nervously. The Velkari arrived at noon. Ambassador Talvesh entered first, his massive frame filling the doorway. His scales were deep black with hints of purple, and his eyes gleamed like polished amber. Behind him came the cubs, Rix and Nyla. They were smaller than their father, only about 1.5 meters tall, but their movements held a predatory grace that made everyone instinctively step back. Their scales hadn't fully hardened yet, showing patches of softer gray beneath the growing black armor. Their claws clicked against the floor with each step. Hyun walked forward to greet them while everyone else maintained a respectful distance. He extended his hand to the ambassador in the human gesture of greeting. Talvesh looked at the small, fragile hand for a long moment before carefully taking it. His massive palm could have crushed every bone in Hyun's hand, but his grip was surprisingly gentle. The cubs watched this interaction with intense focus. Their eyes tracked every movement Hyun made, measuring him the way predators measure potential prey. Rix tilted his head and a low rumble came from his throat. It wasn't quite a growl, but it wasn't friendly either. Nyla's tail swished back and forth, disturbing the air with enough force to flutter papers on nearby desks. Hyun knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the cubs. This made the security team extremely nervous, but he ignored their worried murmurs. He looked at Rix first, then Nyla, meeting their gaze without fear or aggression. He spoke to them in a calm, even tone. He told them his name was Hyun, and he would be their teacher. He said he was pleased to meet them and hoped they would learn many interesting things together. The cubs seemed confused by this response. They were used to people backing away, showing fear, or trying to dominate them. This human did neither. He simply spoke to them like they were normal students. Nyla took a step closer, sniffing at Hyun with her advanced olfactory sensors. She could probably detect his heart rate, his chemical composition, everything about his physical state. Hyun remained still and let her investigate. Ambassador Talvesh explained that the cubs were here as part of a new initiative. The Velkari High Command wanted to improve relations with other species, particularly humans. The cubs would attend classes and learn about different cultures. The ambassador's tone suggested he had his doubts about whether this would work, but he was committed to trying. The first week was chaos. Rix destroyed 3 desks by gripping them too hard during lessons. Nyla accidentally knocked over an entire shelf of laboratory equipment when her tail got excited during an experiment. They growled at other students who came too close. They refused to work in groups, insisting on completing all tasks alone. Several times they got into dominance displays with each other, which involved a lot of roaring and posturing that terrified everyone else in the room. Hyun handled each incident with remarkable calm. When Rix destroyed a desk, Hyun simply moved him to a reinforced seat designed for heavy-gravity species. When Nyla's tail caused problems, he taught her exercises to improve her spatial awareness. When they growled at other students, he firmly but gently explained that this behavior was not acceptable in his classroom. When they fought each other, he separated them and made them write reports about why pack cohesion was important for successful predators. The other instructors thought he was insane. Professor Minho pulled him aside after class one day and asked if he had a death wish. These were Velkari cubs, not human children. They could kill him in seconds if they decided he was prey. Hun just smiled and said that was exactly why it was important to treat them with respect rather than fear. Fear would trigger their hunting instincts. Respect would trigger their social instincts. By the end of the first week, something interesting started to happen. The cubs began waiting outside Hyun's office before class. They stopped growling at other students unless those students showed aggression first. Rix actually asked a question during a lecture about symbiotic relationships, his first voluntary participation. Nyla started bringing her completed homework assignments to Hyun's desk instead of leaving them scattered on her workstation. The breakthrough came during a discussion about pack dynamics. Hyun was explaining how different species formed social bonds, using examples from Earth animals. He talked about wolves and how they protected each other. He mentioned lions and their pride structures. He described how even the fiercest predators needed companionship and social connection to thrive. Rix interrupted, his voice a deep rumble. He said that Velkari didn't need such things. They were warriors. They stood alone. Hyun looked at him thoughtfully and then asked a simple question. If that was true, why did Rix and Nyla always stay close to each other? Why did they sleep near their father? Why did young Velkari travel in sibling groups until they reached maturity? The question hung in the air. Rix had no answer. Nyla's eyes widened slightly as she processed this idea. Maybe, Hyun suggested gently, being strong didn't mean being alone. Maybe real strength came from knowing when to rely on others. The cubs were quiet for the rest of that class. But when the lesson ended, neither of them rushed out like usual. They stayed watching Hyun as he gathered his materials, and for the first time since arriving at the academy, they looked less like dangerous predators and more like confused children trying to understand a complicated universe. The second week brought new challenges. Rix was struggling with mathematics, particularly the complex calculations required for understanding orbital mechanics. Hyun noticed him getting frustrated during class, his claws digging small grooves into his reinforced desk. After the lesson ended, Hyun asked Rix to stay behind. The young Valkyrie looked ready to refuse, his pride wounded by the suggestion that he needed extra help. Hyun didn't phrase it as help. He simply said he wanted to show Rix a different way of thinking about the problem. Instead of using the standard equations that worked well for species with different cognitive patterns, Hyun had spent his evening researching Valkyrie hunting mathematics. Their brains naturally calculated trajectories for pouncing on prey, factoring in gravity, wind resistance, and target movement. Hyun showed Rix how orbital mechanics was essentially the same thing, just with larger objects and no atmosphere to complicate things. Something clicked in Rix's mind. His eyes brightened and he worked through 3 problems in quick succession. He looked at Hyun with what might have been respect or maybe just surprise that a prey species could understand how his brain worked. Before leaving, Rix did something unexpected. He made a soft chirping sound, which Hyun later learned was how young Valkyrie expressed gratitude to their parents. Nyla's challenge was different. She was brilliant at the academic work, but struggled with the social aspects of classroom life. During group projects, she would dominate completely, making all decisions and ignoring her teammates' input. This wasn't malicious, just instinctive. In Valkyrie culture, the strongest led and others followed. The concept of collaboration between equals was foreign to her. Hyun assigned her to work with Bora, a Gentari student who was physically small but intellectually fierce. Bora refused to be intimidated by Nyla's size or growling. When Nyla tried to take over their project about atmospheric composition, Bora simply pointed out that Nyla's approach would take 3 days while her method would take 1. She presented the calculations to prove it. Nyla was forced to admit the smaller creature was right. The two worked together, Nyla providing physical labor to build their demonstration model, while Bora handled the precise measurements and chemical mixing. By the end, they had created the best project in the class. Nyla seemed genuinely proud of what they had accomplished together. She even touched noses with Bora in the Gentari gesture of friendship, something nobody had ever expected to see. The real turning point came during a field trip to one of Earth's nature preserves. Director Minho had organized an expedition for all xenobiology students to observe Earth's diverse ecosystems. Hyun led a group that included the cubs, along with students from 6 other species. They traveled to a large forest preserve that had been protected for over 200 years. As they walked through the forest, Hyun pointed out various plants and animals, explaining Earth's evolutionary history. He talked about how competition and cooperation both played roles in survival. He showed them a termite mound and explained how millions of small insects worked together to build something no individual could create. He pointed to a tree and described how it traded nutrients with underground fungal networks in exchange for water and minerals. Rix seemed particularly interested in Earth's predators. He asked many questions about wolves, tigers, and bears. Hyun explained their hunting strategies, their social structures, their relationships with their young. He mentioned that many Earth predators were actually very gentle with their cubs, playing with them, teaching them, protecting them during their vulnerable years. They came across a human family having a picnic near a stream. The family had 2 small children, probably around 5 and 7 years old. The children were laughing and chasing each other, completely carefree. Their parents watched with obvious affection, smiling at their children's joy. The scene was completely ordinary for Earth, but the alien students found it fascinating. Nyla asked why the human parents didn't train their children to fight or hunt. Hyun explained that human children had a long period of development where they were allowed to just be children. They played, they learned, they explored the world without the burden of survival training. That came later, gradually as they matured. The goal was to let them develop their personalities, their interests, their emotional connections, before adding adult responsibilities. The cubs watched the human family for a long time. Something in their posture changed, became less rigid. Hyun realized they were seeing something they had never experienced. Valkyrie cubs were trained from the moment they could walk. Play was always structured around combat practice. Rest was seen as weakness. They grew up knowing only discipline and preparation for warfare. As the group prepared to leave, Hyun noticed Rix was having trouble with something on his back, between his shoulder scales where his arms couldn't reach. It looked like he had gotten tree sap stuck there during their forest walk. Without thinking, Hyun reached up and carefully cleaned it away. His fingers found a spot behind Rix's auditory ridge and scratched gently, trying to help with what looked like an irritation. Rix froze. Every muscle in his body tensed. Then slowly, he made a sound that nobody had ever heard from a Valkyrie before. It was a deep, rumbling purr, similar to what a cat might make but much lower and more resonant. Nyla's head snapped around to stare at her brother. The other students backed away nervously, unsure if this was dangerous, but Hyun recognized the sound for what it was. It was contentment. He kept scratching that spot gently and Rix continued purring. When Hyun finally stopped, Rix looked at him with an expression that was hard to read on a Valkyrie face but seemed like confusion mixed with something else. Maybe trust. Maybe the first stirrings of affection. From that moment, everything changed. The cubs started following Hyun everywhere. They waited outside his office before classes. They walked beside him in the hallways. When he sat down, they would position themselves nearby, not quite touching but close. Other students and staff found it unnerving to see the dangerous predators acting like devoted pets, but Hyun treated it as perfectly natural. Professor Jiwoo asked him if he understood what was happening. The cubs were imprinting on him, forming the kind of bond they normally only formed with their parents. It was unprecedented for Valkyrie to bond with another species like this. Hyun said he understood, and he took the responsibility seriously. These cubs needed someone who saw them as more than future weapons. They needed someone who let them be young, even if just for a little while. During the next class, Hyun was explaining the concept of mutualistic symbiosis. He used examples from nature where two different species helped each other survive. Cleaner fish and sharks, birds and rhinoceros, bees and flowers. He suggested that perhaps intelligent species could learn from these examples, forming partnerships based on mutual benefit rather than dominance. Rix raised his hand, his first truly voluntary participation beyond asking questions. He said that Valkyrie had always believed strength meant independence. But maybe, he suggested hesitantly, maybe there was strength in knowing who to trust. Maybe choosing your allies carefully was smarter than fighting everything alone. Hyun smiled and said that was a very wise observation. The other students in the class looked at Rix with new respect. Even Nyla seemed proud of her brother, and in that moment, in that simple classroom discussion, the seeds of something revolutionary were planted. The idea that the galaxy's most feared warriors might have something to learn from humanity's gentle approach to connection and trust.